All right, today we're going to talk about the modern world, which we're going to call from really the early 90s on, so the fall of the Soviet Union on, is kind of the world that we live in today. It looked a lot different after the fall of the Soviet Union. It took up a big chunk of East Europe and Central Asia, and the map totally changed when that was redrawn. The Soviet Union was in if it wasn't the so-called the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union was kind of the controlling power of a lot of those Eastern European nations. So the first place that was significantly changed in the last little bit was Eastern Europe. So back in the early 90s, there was a conflict there that the United Nations was involved in Yugoslavia. So ethnic majorities, and ethnicity is that, race and cultural identity. Ethnic majority trying to push ethnic minorities out and take control of land. So you've got blends of Christians and Muslims and Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians and fighting over territory there. And we end up with the countries of like Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina were all part of what was called Yugoslavia. So the same thing with the Czech Republic. It used to be called Czechoslovakia. Now it's Czech Republic. Another place that massive change was and is happening is in Africa. As they were left as we were talking about colonialism and imperialism. Remember, like the French being in Vietnam, the French were all over Africa, as well as the British, the Germans, the Belgians. As that kind of dwindled and Africans started taking control of their countries, they were kind of left with borders that were drawn by Europeans and left with a lot of conflict. So there's been civil war all over Africa and lots of really terrible, horrible, unimaginable things, which has created issues all over the world. There's massive immigration to countries like France and the United States because people are fleeing, just horrible things, civil wars. This points out in the Sudan, which is now called the Sudan and South Sudan, in this area called Darfur, the ethnic majority there, killed hundreds of thousands of people and millions displaced in these awful, not concentration camps, but like people that are displaced. They move into these refugee camps, and millions of people in those, and just awful things happening. So Africa still struggles with that as for years they were controlled by colonial kind of rulers, and now they try to figure out how to rule those countries on their own. Also in the Middle East has been constantly, since even before the time of Jesus, you have clashes between Jewish people and pagan people, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and then you have now the major clashes are between Jewish people and Israel and Muslim-controlled territories. One big thing that happened in the early 90s was Saddam Hussein was leading, and this actually started in the 80s, but a country called Iraq. They had conflicts with Iran before in the early 80s. There was a war that happened in Iran, but they attacked a little country called Kuwait, and the United States had some stake there in oil. Iraq invaded that to get control of oil and started the first Persian Gulf War, which was a quick and swift war as far as just gaining control, but never really got resolved. So Saddam Hussein stayed in power and we had to go back there and kind of deal with that later in the 2000s, which we'll get to. That Muslim world that we talk about has a lot of extremist groups attached to it, and terror is the big thing that you guys have really grown up with before you were born. But terrorism, 9/11, even before then, there were some attacks. If you look on page 982, it shows all these terror attacks, and the book defines terrorism as the use of violence to create fear and achieve a political goal. I remember in 1992, I think, I went to New York City on a trip, and we couldn't go see the Twin Towers, or we could see them, but we couldn't go in them because someone had attacked the Twin Towers, that planted a bomb in the basement and actually exploded a bomb, just didn't do any massive damage. Same thing with another, actually an American citizen attacked a federal building in Oklahoma City. You'll see that one on there. But these Muslim groups in the early 2000s especially were attacking all over the world, and we know that the group led by Osama bin Laden, called Al-Qaeda, planned an attack on the World Trade Center, the two towers, the Pentagon, and a planned attack probably on the White House or the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. As well. Killed thousands of people, about 3,000 people were killed directly in those attacks, and it kind of set off this war on terror, something that we'd been dealing with before, but set off this war on terror all over the world, where we were now going to Afghanistan to find Osama bin Laden, who was kind of hiding under the government that was friendly to terrorists called the Taliban. The Taliban was not directly responsible for those, but they would let groups like Al-Qaeda kind of hide in their presence. Another extremist Muslim group, very anti-women's rights, and a very conservative extremist Muslim group was in charge of Afghanistan. So we were fighting wars in Iraq, Afghanistan. We were fighting in Iraq, the second Gulf War, because Mr. Saddam Hussein was still in charge there, and we believed that he was making weapons of mass destruction. That was a big word in the early 2000s, were these weapons of mass destruction. We ended up finding Saddam Hussein, kind of chasing him out, and he was later executed. Osama bin Laden was also found. He was in Islamabad, Pakistan, and just like the middle of a city, and the Navy SEALs found him, and he was killed. So kind of brings us to the modern world. I'm going to let you guys kind of answer big things that we talk about in your lifetime as technology has changed massively. When I was in high school, that's the first time I remember using the internet. We had computers. Heck, we used computers mostly just for playing Oregon Trail in school when I was in grade school. And we started typing and, using a little bit of word processing when I was in junior high. And then in high school, this thing called the internet started becoming more and more part of our lives. Now, of course, we connect electronically. Everything and more than I could do even in the late 90s, early 2000s, I can do on my phone right now as I'm recording a video on my phone that I'll upload to YouTube, that I'll upload to Google Classroom, that will come out to you today at 5 o'clock. So just managing technology and privacy are going to be huge issues as we go forward. Obviously, climate change is something we've been talking about massively in the last 10 years have been huge. Deforestation, desertification, and then the melting ice caps, and how much have humans affected the the climate and what kind of effect are we going to have on our world to come. The population is a big issue. We're about at 7 billion, maybe a little more than 7 billion right now. That is a lot more than it was 100 years ago. I mean, huge population gains. How is the world going to manage an increasing population? You have to feed that population. You have to provide health care, education, and all these basic rights and necessities to a growing population. So the last question I ask you today is, what do you think is the biggest issue that your generation will face? Whether it's growing superpowers and the concerns of war, or maybe it's global pandemics, maybe it's overpopulation, maybe it's climate change, maybe it's the control of technology and where that leads us. But think about that a little bit, and as you get to be an adult, what are going to be the things that people are talking about in 30 years that your generation has to face? It's been a great year, guys.